What kind of people forget how to make fire? Several thousand, an entire civilization carrying every tool their ancestors brought from the mainland. Then the sea rose and sealed them on an island for 10,000 years. They forgot how to catch fish, forgot bone tools, then forgot the one skill no other known humans have ever forgotten. What the outside world did when it finally reached them was worse. The archaeological record beneath Tasmania holds something that should be impossible: evidence of a civilization running in reverse. Roughly 30 millennia ago, the first humans walked south across a broad plain connecting mainland Australia to what is now Tasmania. Sea levels sat over 100 meters below where they are today. The plain stretched wider than some modern countries, flat, open, rich with game. Families followed the herds. Generation after generation pressed further south until they reached the coast at the bottom of the known world. Then the ice began to melt. Over the next 6 millennia, sea levels climbed roughly a meter per century. The plain between the mainland and Tasmania shrank year after year. Camps that once sat a full day's walk from the water vanished under tidal surge within a lifetime. By around 12 millennia ago, Bass Strait was open ocean, over 200 kilometers of cold, wind-driven water. And the several thousand people living on Tasmania watched the last visible land on the northern horizon slide beneath the waves. No boat they possessed could cross that distance. No message from the mainland would ever arrive. Picture yourself standing on that coast. You carry everything your ancestors carried: stone tools, bone needles, fishing techniques passed down across 1,000 generations. But from this moment forward, no traveler will bring a better design. No distant band will introduce a new way of working bone or shaping stone. Every skill your descendants will ever know must survive inside a group smaller than a modern high school. For the first several millennia, nothing visibly changed. Then the record begins to shift. Around 8 millennia ago, fish made up over 20% of the Tasmanian diet. It was the second most valued food source on the island. Then, fish bones start disappearing from archaeological sites, not because the fish left surrounding waters, but because the people stopped catching them. By 3,800 years ago, fish had vanished entirely from the record. European explorers arriving long after reported that aboriginal Tasmanians refused to eat fish at all. The sight of it disgusted them. A people who fished successfully for over 20 millennia lost not just the skill, but the memory that the skill had ever mattered. Bone tools followed the same path. 7 millennia ago, Tasmanians shaped bone at roughly 1/3 the frequency they worked stone. By 4 millennia later, the ratio had dropped to 1/15. Within another 1,000 years, bone tools disappear from the record entirely. And then came the loss that sets Tasmania apart from every other human society ever documented: fire. Every known culture on Earth, from the Arctic to the equator, from dense jungle to open desert, has kept the ability to create fire from scratch. Every known culture except one. European observers in the 18th and 19th centuries described aboriginal Tasmanians carrying fire with them at all times, burning brands clutched in their hands on every journey, smoldering embers wrapped in bundles of kelp by the women who walked at the center of each traveling group. They maintained fire with extraordinary discipline. They used it to reshape the island through controlled burns that refined Tasmania's ecology across millennia. But according to multiple early European accounts, they could not start a fire from nothing. If every flame in camp was drowned by a storm that lasted too long, they walked, sometimes for days, until they found another band whose fire had survived. Imagine depending on something so completely that one prolonged downpour can strip it from you. Your warmth, your cooked food, your defense against a winter that drops below freezing, gone. And the only way to recover it is to walk through that cold until you find someone whose flame held. How does a society lose what no other known society on Earth has ever lost? One widely discussed model, proposed by anthropologist Joseph Henrich, points not to intelligence but to numbers. His research suggested that when a community drops below a critical size, complex skills erode across generations, not because people become less capable, but because learning is never perfect. A student never fully replicates what a master knows. In a large group, enough skilled practitioners exist to keep collective knowledge stable. In a community of perhaps 4,000, scattered across an island the size of Ireland, each generation absorbs slightly less than the one before. Over centuries, that silent erosion strips away what cannot be afforded to lose. Tools simplify, techniques disappear. Knowledge that required generations to build can collapse after one bad season. Tasmania did not produce weaker minds. It produced too few people to carry the full weight of what they knew. But here is where most accounts of Aboriginal Tasmania stop, at the loss. And stopping there is the most misleading part of the entire story. Because the people who forgot how to fish, who abandoned bone tools, who were unable to restart a fire from scratch, survived. Not for centuries, for over 400 generations. Longer than the Egyptian dynasties lasted, longer than Rome, longer than every European kingdom combined. Sit with that number for a moment. 400 generations of storms, droughts, failed hunts, and freezing winters, without one resource arriving from beyond their coast, without one new idea crossing the water. They did not simply endure. They adapted so thoroughly that the island itself bent to their design. When fish disappeared from their diet, they replaced the lost calories with precision. Coastal bands turned to shellfish gathered by hand along rocky shores. Women dove into water cold enough to numb your arms in minutes, prying abalone and mussels from submerged rock with bare fingers. No tools, no nets, just skin against stone and near-freezing surf. Inland groups tracked seals along seasonal migration routes, coordinating hunts against animals that outweighed any person in the band. Each autumn, they harvested mutton birds, short-tailed shearwaters returning to the same nesting colonies by the millions. One good season's catch could sustain a band through the darkest months of winter. Think about what it meant to carry fire without being able to restart it. If your embers died, if a downpour soaked every bundle of kelp your women carried, your band lost warmth, cooked food, and the only barrier between your children and a freezing night. You walked, sometimes for days, through sleet and wind, across terrain known only by memory, until you reached another band whose flame had survived. In a Tasmanian winter, that walk was not an inconvenience. It was a race against the cold. Yet they turned that fragility into a system no modern land management agency has matched. Bands of 40 to 80 people moved along seasonal circuits refined across millennia. Several times each year, multiple bands gathered, trading ochre, arranging marriages, settling territorial disputes, and renewing the alliances that held the island's scattered communities together. The women who carried smoldering embers at the center of every traveling group formed the most critical link. When one band's fire survived a storm and another's did not, the network between them kept the flame alive. No band could last alone. The fire burning in their hands was more than warmth. It was proof that the web of relationships holding their world together had not broken. They used that fire to engineer the landscape itself. Controlled burns cleared dense scrub, opening grasslands that funneled grazing animals into predictable corridors. Picture the coordination. Bands spread across an island the size of Ireland, each burning in the right season, each reading wind and terrain well enough to guide flame without losing control. When European settlers arrived in the early 19th century, they described what looked like a designed estate. Open meadows, groves of well-spaced trees, corridors of grass running between forested ridges. They assumed nature had arranged it. They were looking at the result of deliberate human work sustained longer than any empire. Their culture held a complexity that tools alone could never reveal. At least 5 distinct languages existed on the island, so different that speakers from opposite coasts could not understand each other. They gathered at burial grounds for night-long cremation vigils over their dead. They carved raised scars into their skin that encoded kinship and territorial belonging across generations. They navigated by constellations no European astronomer would ever chart, and their oral histories mapped the landscape, water sources, food corridors, boundaries between bands, with a precision that remained stable across millennia. If you measure a civilization by its toolkit, Tasmania looks like regression. If you measure it by how long a people sustained themselves on a harsh, isolated landmass without any outside input, No recorded civilization comes close. They had built an equilibrium, not progress as the modern world defines it, something older and harder to replicate, a way of living so precisely tuned to one place that it held steady for 10 unbroken millennia. That equilibrium held until a morning in 1642, when a Dutch sail appeared on the southern horizon. What followed is a pattern that is repeated on every isolated island the modern world has ever reached. It always ends the same way. Abel Tasman sailed past Tasmania in 1642 and never set foot on shore. French explorers reached the coast in 1772, stayed briefly, and departed. For over a century and a half, the contacts were scattered and the isolation held. Then, in 1803, the British arrived to stay. The first settlement at Risdon Cove opened with a massacre. On the 3rd of May, soldiers confronted a group of aboriginal Tasmanians, whether a hunting party or a ceremonial gathering remains disputed, and opened fire. Estimates of the dead range from 3 to 50. No British soldier was injured. What followed was not a war in any conventional sense. It was an erasure. Settlers fenced grazing land that Aboriginal bands had burned and managed for millennia. They shot the kangaroos those burns had been designed to attract. They blocked access to shellfish beds along the coast. And when Aboriginal Tasmanians fought back, spearing cattle, ambushing isolated homesteads, the colonial government responded with the longest declaration of martial law in Australian history. In November 1828, every Aboriginal person in Tasmania became a legal target. The order held for more than 3 years. The killing that followed claimed an estimated 600 to 900 Aboriginal lives. Roving parties tracked families through the bush and shot them where they slept. Settlers left poisoned flour at known campsites. Children were seized and placed with colonists as unpaid servants. If you had been alive on that island in 1829, stepping past the tree line in daylight meant risking a musket ball from a direction you would never see. Then came the Black Line. In October 1830, the colonial government assembled over 2,200 men, soldiers, convict laborers, and armed civilians, into a human chain and swept from the northern coast southward across the full width of the island. Their mission was to drive every remaining Aboriginal person into a narrow peninsula at the southeast corner. Over 2,000 armed men. Weeks of organized movement through some of the most punishing terrain in the southern hemisphere. And when the line reached its destination, they had captured fewer than 5 people. Fewer than 5. Out of a people who had been reading that ground for 100 centuries. You already understand why. Every ridge, every creek bed, every corridor of wind-bent scrub was mapped inside knowledge that no military survey could reproduce. The British brought numbers and firearms. The Tasmanians brought 10 millennia of knowing exactly where to disappear. But what the army failed to accomplish by force, one man achieved with a promise. George Augustus Robinson was a self-taught preacher who convinced colonial authorities he could succeed where 2,000 soldiers had not. Between 1829 and 1834, he walked into the bush and found the surviving bands one by one. He brought Aboriginal guides, among them a young woman named Truganini of the Nuunoan people. She had watched her mother murdered by sailors and her sisters taken by sealers. She had every reason to refuse any outsider's hand. But Robinson offered something no one else had, a promise that her people would be protected. They believed him. Band after band walked out of the forest. If you have ever placed your trust in someone because the only alternative was watching your family die in a landscape already half emptied, you understand why they followed. Robinson delivered roughly 300 survivors to a settlement called Wybalenna on Flinders Island, a wind-battered rock in Bass Strait. The conditions were a death sentence dressed as protection. The housing was neither warm nor dry. The water was fouled. The soil grew nothing. Traditional ceremonies were forbidden. Infant mortality approached 100%. A government official who inspected Wybalenna in 1836 concluded that its residents were being deliberately exterminated. When the settlement closed in 1847, 47 people walked out. 15 men, 22 women, 10 children, out of roughly 300 who had entered. The survivors were moved to Oyster Cove, south of Hobart. Within 2 decades, fewer than a dozen remained. Truganini died on the 8th of May, 1876. She had asked to be buried at sea. Instead, her body was exhumed 2 years later. Her skeleton was mounted and placed in a museum display case, where it stood for nearly 70 years. Her remains were not cremated and returned to the ocean until 1976, 100 years after she died. Newspapers in 1876 declared her the last aboriginal Tasmanian. The extinction of an entire people, they wrote, was complete. They were wrong. If their story matters to you, subscribe. Your support helps this channel continue uncovering the histories that were nearly erased. Truganini was not the last. Communities of Aboriginal Tasmanian descendants had survived on Cape Barren Island and scattered islands across Bass Strait. People of mixed heritage the colonial record chose not to count. Today, thousands of palawa descendants live in Tasmania and across mainland Australia, fighting for land rights, cultural recognition, and the return of ancestral remains that sat in museum collections for over a century. The answer to the question this video opened with is simpler than you expected. What kind of people forget how to make fire? People with no one left to teach them. Too few minds to hold the knowledge that once took a continent to build. But they did not disappear. They survived 10 millennia alone. They survived everything the outside world threw at them after that. And the ones who tried hardest to erase them are the ones history has already begun to forget.